Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks to the Sachs Associates for inviting me and the panel to the Immuno-Oncology Innovation Forum. I'm going to be starting this discussion with something somewhat unusual, given the business development, licensing, M&A focus of this conference, which is to talk about pricing and reimbursement in oncology. And I guess to make sure that this is relevant to you all, I wanted to start with some data about partnerships. The larger point not being the number of partnerships, but the fact that the reason for this extraordinary number of partnerships in oncology relative to every other indication is because oncology is one of the very few areas where payers really can't say no, where there is still significant pricing freedom. And the reason for that is that oncology is one of the few areas which is still open to free prescribing by oncologists in general. In virtually every other category, this is not true. But in oncology, it is, and there are really four basic reasons. One is regulatory. Oncology is one of the 6 protected classes by CMS. Now it's less protected than it was because now health plans are allowed to do certain kinds of restrictions like step edits. But it's also somewhat, but the protected class issue is protective in part because there is so little genericization on the very largest area of oncology, which is the protein side, the biological side. There's in oral small molecule oncology, generics can be used ahead of brands, but that's not really true on the biological side. Second big issue is that physicians are themselves hugely incentivized to use more expensive drugs. That's because they actually buy most of the oncologics that are used, again, the protein, the biologics, and the way they are paid as a percent of the price of the drug, the more profitable it is for them. And right now, physicians, oncologists probably make more money on the drugs, or at least as much money on the drugs as they do on the services they provide. The other thing is that in most other categories, payers require prior authorization, that is some kind of restrictions based on the label. But in oncology, it's much broader than that. You don't only have, you can prescribe an oncology drug and get it reimbursed as long as that oncology drug is listed in one of the 5 compendia, most importantly, the NCCN. It gives an extraordinary latitude for providers. And then finally, there is the headline problem. Cancer is in terms of newspaper headlines, that's the one place payers are really most scared. They don't want to see a father or mother say, I can't get this oncologic which would save my life and allow my children to have parents. It's just not possible. So payers shy away from any kind of restrictions for that. The issue, however, is that as the prices increase, and they've increased quite dramatically over the last several years, the cost shares for patients have gone up pretty significantly. So now the average cost share in oncology is around $1,300. That means, and that's pretty challenging for most Medicare patients in particular to pay for, given that the average Medicare beneficiary has about $27,000 a year in income. So this can be a pretty significant challenge. And that means that ultimately the patient as payer becomes self-restricting. So if you have an out-of-pocket somewhere around $2,000, about half of the time, patients just don't fill the prescription. Now, these are orals, but it would also be true on the biologic side. Now, it is true, however, that payers themselves are becoming significantly more aggressive in their approaches to oncology. So Express Script, for example, as this chart indicates, is now excluding many oncology drugs from its formulary. Roughly half or so are small molecule, roughly half are large molecule proteins. And that's just been increasing. And that's because Express Scripts clients, which are the payers, the health plans, and the employers, are more and more interested in controlling what they see as their number one cost problem, which is oncology. Now, so far, the testing ground has been on the oral side of oncology. It's a smaller spend, and it's slightly easier, not easy, to manage this for the payers. So far, the biggest rebates we've seen in oncology, in small molecule oncology, are about 7%. Compare that to insulin, where we've seen 80% rebates. And in immunology, rebates can be certainly 30%, maybe even 40% for drugs in the dermatology space and in RA. One of the challenges is that that payers can't force, or often can't force, the use of a specific drug, can't force a preference to a specific drug unless the docs in the health plan get on board. But the fact is that the interest has been growing, particularly among those plans where they have risk-sharing agreements with the physicians, and there are an increasing number of those. And what's happening is that as those risk-sharing agreements with physician practices increase, so does the appetite for value-based agreements with pharma companies. And now we're beginning to see more of these deals being talked about. And in fact, we at Real Endpoints just did what we think of as the first two significant value-based agreements in small molecule oncology, again, in highly competitive categories, with really significant rebate possibilities there. And that's because payers are willing to start to pressure, particularly these risk-sharing practices, to specify, to prefer specific drugs, good for the practices to lower costs, good for the plan to lower costs. And they would like to create precedent among manufacturers as well. We already did it with Company A. Shouldn't you be thinking about this as well? We've also seen perhaps the most significant change in oncology in biosimilars. Biosimilars have not been a significant force in most categories, but they have begun to be significant in oncology. And that's because while biosimilars are relatively expensive compared to other quasi-generic type drugs, that is to say, they may have a price reduction of 20%, maybe 25% to the innovator. And that doesn't really help when there are, as in immunology, significant rebates, 30%, 40%, maybe greater. So you don't see significant significant biosimilar inroads into those categories. But in cancer, where there's been very little rebating, suddenly 20%, 25% looks really good. And that's why Avastin, for example, has lost a huge percentage of its market, and Herceptin has lost a huge percentage of its market to these biosimilars. That's just going to increase as we see more biosimilars come out and for more categories. We think that the next frontier of this is going to be in categories where there are no biosimilars, but there's tremendous competition. Now, so far, in a category like PD-1s, the slide is not completely updated with all of the indications that everybody has, but it's pretty much, it's pretty current. Where most people have gone is trying to focus on categories, on indications where there is no other drug. So, something like Libtayo started out with cutaneous squamous cell and went to locally advanced basal cell carcinoma. The GSK drug, Jemperli, went for endometrial carcinoma, where there are few, if any, competitors. That's largely because they have not wanted to do anything like a rebate for share strategy, in part because it's difficult, given that they don't have all of those indications, they're not yet in the compendia. And in part because nobody in pharma really wants to start the kinds of pricing wars that would then begin to take down the prices of oncology drugs. I think you might also see something, interestingly enough, in some of the more advanced categories, technologically advanced categories, like CAR-T or T-cell receptor type technologies, where you see a huge concentration in therapeutic areas. So with 18 of these, where so much is in blood cancers, particularly leukemias and B-cell lymphomas. So even in these areas, they are sort of primed, ripe for some kind of economic competition. And already you're seeing some, hospitals who are centers of excellence are actually now, of course, preferring one drug to another, one therapy to another. Where I think we're really going to see a big test is in companies who are really pursuing the price-cutting strategy. And no company better represents this issue than EQRX, which has focused on cancer as well as immunology as part of its as its strategy. And investors seem to love this idea. It's raised almost $750 million. This is huge, and this is for a company whose avowed goal is to cut prices. So their approach, quite simply, is to inexpensively in-license drugs. And those drugs are me-toos or maybe me-betters. They're going after both biologicals and NCEs, but the ones that I've seen have been mostly biologicals. And there's a PD-1, there's a PD-L1, there's a CDK4/6, there's an EGFR inhibitor, all going into these very crowded categories. The goal is to raise lower cost capital because they are going after drugs with known mechanisms of action and very well trod regulatory pathways. So theoretically lower risk, lower capital cost. And then the goal is to sell these drugs for a third the price of the innovators. Now that would allow this company to sell below even the post-rebate prices, for example, in immunology. That's less important in oncology. But also to drive patient acceptance, because the patients who pay their cost shares based on the WAC price will be paying a significantly lower out-of-pocket cost for drugs from EQRX, which will have, of course, a significantly lower WAC cost. Now, there are plenty of challenges to this. I don't want to minimize them. EQRX is still facing new molecule development risk. There is no extrapolation as there is with biosimilars. That is to say, biosimilar can be used in any indication that the reference product is used in. That's not going to be true for EQRX. Biosimilars face a manufacturing problem. It's expensive to manufacture drugs. EQRX is going to face that as well. We've talked about the incentives that oncologists have for buy and bill. That is to say, they make more money the more expensive the drug. EQRX will also have to wrestle with that. And then there are other issues that it will face for non-oncology drugs, including the fact that PBMs guarantee their clients a certain level of rebate, and EQRX will have no rebates attached to what it's doing. It's just going to sell its drug for a lower price. So just to wrap up, oncology is prime for payer strategies, for payer restriction strategies. The challenge is whether or not it's going to be how quickly, not whether, but how quickly these restrictions are going to come to this category. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Bibhash to start the panel.